So welcome back to Afri-CAN. At Pharo Foundation, we have three missions, one in education, one in water, and one in productivity. And these missions drive our work across Ethiopia, Somaliland, Kenya, and Rwanda. As our missions progress and we look to scale up our cost-effective and evidence-based interventions, it's clear to us that utilizing a range of innovative financing instruments to scale up our missions is critical. Amongst these instruments, outcomes-based financing is gaining traction and proving very effective. Unlike traditional grant funding, where payment is usually made in advance for pre-specified activities, under outcomes-based financing, the funder and the recipient of funding pre-agree a set of outcomes that must be achieved to trigger payments. Models like impact bonds and outcomes-based contracts are demonstrating strong results on two levels. The first one is in improving services through delivery of mission objectives, and secondly, in attracting private capital for extra leverage to clearer results-driven mechanisms. So to explore how outcomes-based funding works and why it is so successful, I have invited Adriana Balducci, who is head of program development at the Education Outcomes Fund, EOF for short, and Chloe Edleston, who is an associate at Social Finance. Adriana is a global education practitioner with over 13 years of experience spanning donors, international organizations, implementing partners, and academic institutions. At EOF, she leads the design and development of large-scale programs in early childhood care and education, which is one of our fortes as well, basic education and skills for employment, ensuring that funding translates into measurable improvements in learning and workforce outcomes. Prior to joining EOF, Adriana led the UK Prosperity Fund's education and skills portfolio in Brazil, working closely with the Brazilian government to drive national education reform. She also oversaw the WISE Qatar Foundation's global education initiatives, shaping strategic programs that foster innovation and policy transformation. Adriana's contributions to the field extend to academia and international policy development. She co-authored a UNESCO publication on the role of women in African history, launched a high-level policy dialogue on South-South cooperation between the Brazilian Ministry of Education and UNESCO, and served as an adjunct professor of international relations at Sciences Po in Paris. Chloe Edleston works for Social Finance, an innovative finance advisory organization, and currently leads their work in East Africa and is based in Nairobi. She works with philanthropies, donors, and implementing organizations to design and deliver innovative financing approaches that drive better outcomes across the SDGs. With a background in development economics, Chloe brings experience spanning advisory, implementation, and strategy development. She's worked closely with government partners, multilaterals, and NGOs to reimagine how impact is financed and measured. So let's kick off the interesting bit now. I'm going to ask Adriana the first question, which is really a task, which is to explain in simple terms the concept of outcomes-based financing. And, thinking also about whether there are many different applications of the concept, and if so, how do they vary in relation to who is incentivized for results, and the sources of funding involved.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is paying for what matters. There are different types of mechanisms, but yeah, I will be particularly talking about outcomes-based financing in education. So you explained very well, Francesca, that the concept is simple. So in outcomes-based financing, we are channeling money to pay when results are actually achieved. So instead of paying for activities or inputs like training sessions, materials, enrollment, funders, and specifically in the EOF's model, governments too, they agree to pay once specific outcomes are reached. For example, if more children can read at grade level or more young people are getting sustainable jobs. So this model shifts the focus from what is being done to what is being achieved. And because of this focus on final outcomes, it gives the implementing partners more flexibility to find what works best in their context. So we are not prescriptive on the way they're going to deliver the trainings or mentor the teachers, but we are definitely going to measure whether children will be learning at the end. This model increases accountability because funding is directly tied to real measurable impact. But let me give you a specific example of one of our programs currently in implementation, the Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenge. In this particular program, we are aimed to incentivize learning gains. So the way that we operate outcomes-based financing is that we are the incentivized agents are the implementing partners, NGOs or private sector organizations that are contracted to deliver the package of interventions on the ground. And the funds are flowing both from donors and the governments. There are different types of models or programs that are incentivized on the teacher level, such as cash transfers, or even on the government level. For instance, payment by results model, for instance, the World Bank, which is restricted to government meeting certain requirements. But let me go back to my example with Sierra Leone. In that particular case, where the incentivized agent is the implementing partner on the ground, let's take an example of an NGO delivering this program, Save the Children. An independent evaluation firm is going to measure how much children's learnings are improving each year. In the specific context, we're doing an RCT, so against the control group. And based on the yearly results, we are going to pay the Save the Children, but also the other 4 consortium who are delivering the interventions for every child who achieves the targeted learning gains on both literacy and numeracy. So in that particular program, to promote gender equity, we're also paying a 20% premium for every girl who reaches the learning goal. So let's take the example of Rising Academies. If they are supporting a girl who makes the expected progress, they receive a higher payment as a recognition of the additional barriers that these girls face. So these partners, they're doing the real work on the ground. They're teaching the trainings, they're mentoring the school leaders, they're engaging with families and communities. But again, they are only paid once results are achieved. This is the nature of how payment by results, outcomes-based funding, or results-based finance operates in nature.
Wow, that was a brilliant explanation. You brought it really home when you said this bit about the 20% premium per girl who's achieved it. It's quite impressive. Fantastic. Chloe, would you like to tell us, in your view, in what ways outcomes-based financing represents an innovation in the way that we do development philanthropy?
Yes, absolutely. Would love to. And thanks, Adriana, for setting this up so nicely. I think from my perspective, one of our core beliefs is that, what you fund or who you fund is just as important as how you fund it. And I think outcomes-based financing is a real shift in that how. And Adriana, to your point about, we're not just looking at what has been delivered, we're actually looking at what's happened. I think that's the core innovation at the heart of outcomes-based financing. So, it's no longer just about health clinics being built, but actually making sure that health services are being delivered and are actually improving people's lives. And I think, when you start thinking about funding in this way, a couple of really interesting things happen. The first is that you get really good at measuring impact. So outcomes-based funding really relies on having a very clear upfront definition of what good looks like. How do we know when this program has succeeded? And instead of measuring inputs, like how many teachers were hired, how many training programs have been delivered, you start focusing on the actual impact itself. And that really helps create both more transparency about what's working and why, which makes it easier then to replicate, scale up, and improve overall impact. I think the second thing that's really interesting is, and Adriana, you touched on this as well, is that you start to see more innovation at a service delivery level. And that's because service providers themselves are given the flexibility to experiment and to adapt in real time to deliver better outcomes. And I think that's actually quite a big difference from traditional, more input-based grant funding, where there are quite rigid project plans and budgets that often get locked in before implementation happens, and then can be quite difficult to pivot once you realize that actually what we thought was going to happen hasn't happened, and therefore we need to think about this differently. So maybe just to summarize, I think outcomes-based financing is an innovation, not just in how we fund, but also in kind of how we think about value and impact in philanthropy and how we can support innovation at the service delivery level.
Excellent. Wow, those were great sort of complementary views, I think. That was fantastic. Thank you. So going back to Adriana, perhaps. Yes, I think, building on what Chloe has said, outcomes-based financing is this innovation in how we do philanthropy, but it's also quite innovative in terms of the way that development partnerships are managed. And so I'd like to hear from you a little bit how you see it fostering alignment, perhaps among stakeholders and multiple implementers. And maybe again, because it was very useful when you started off with these the example you gave, maybe you can illustrate this with an application to early childhood education, perhaps.
Yes, I can do that. Before answering this question, I just wanted to react to Chloe's. We explained really well, I think, like how we are perceiving and observing innovation on the ground. I mentioned Save the Children earlier because it's a partner we've been working quite a lot with them in different countries. They posted a blog article last year about their experience delivering the Sierra Leone program. How it is, if I'm not mistaken, they're gonna forgive me. Like the name of the article is like what it is to become a results-oriented organization, in which they also explain like how delivering this type of model also had implications and impacted the way they operate internally. And it's quite interesting to see also this innovation playing out on their decision-making processes, performance management, and any other dimensions of delivery that sometimes come a bit unseen because we are looking actually at what is happening in these classrooms, and this innovation is also happening inside these organizations. So very, very nicely mentioned by Chloe. But going back to your question around this alignment among stakeholders, yes, I 100% agree with you. This level of coordination and alignment is very important, and it's quite innovative as well in the development sector. So in this type of mechanisms, there is a natural alignment that needs to be fostered, because the way these programs need to be designed and the way they are implemented brings everyone around the same table with a shared goal, achieving a measurable impact. So unlike traditional models where funding is tied to specific activities we mentioned over and over again, this type of mechanism shifts the conversation, right? The governments, the donors, the implementing partners, the impact investors, which we haven't mentioned much, but they also are a critical player in this model. The evaluation firms, they all share a vested interest in delivering the real results. And this creates a stronger sense of partnership and collaboration. We've been observing this in the many programs we have in our portfolio. It's a very different approach in terms of like how this partnership is fostered rather than a top-down funding relationship. I personally believe it's a more democratic way as well of doing development. And we see that how this plays out also giving voice to governments, to local partners. There are programs even that involve the participating children or families or communities also in the design. There are different ways this model is operated, but we do see that the I think the common thing across all these models and all these experiences is around this fostered collaboration. But to make this collaboration work, a mindset shift is essential. I don't know, Chloe, how you've been observing this in your work, but in our experience, the stakeholders, including governments, donors, implementing partners, even implementing partners sometimes, they often gravitate towards the how, right? What specific interventions should be delivered. And in this model, the priority is to align around the what we are trying to achieve and trusting the local actors to determine how to get there based on their context, their expertise. But again, let me go back to maybe a practical example. You asked, for example, in the early childhood care and education, we are launching our portfolio programs this year in Sierra Leone, Rwanda, and South Africa. In South Africa, for instance, the government's priorities were really clear around expanding access to ECC provision, improving the quality of existing provision, and driving better child development outcomes. And there was like a long process and a lot of work also to understand how closely this was aligned with the donor's interest, and also if that reflected also the challenges that implementing partners were observing on the ground. So this type of work to create this alignment and coordination is paramount, because then we are incentivizing what is absolutely necessary, and there is consensus across all involved parties on what are the challenges we are facing and what needs to be achieved. If there is no buy-in on consensus, the model simply won't work. And it also requires this early and continuous engagement. We definitely need to do this process jointly in a very iterative way. The design sometimes takes time, but the technical is not the technical design that takes time. I would say that at least the way we operate is really like creating this coordination and this alignment that sometimes takes time, but definitely pays off when we see delivery driving good results on the ground, and these partnerships working very nicely, something that sometimes we don't see very clear in other types of funding mechanisms. And yeah, I also believe that this type of collaboration, this type of alignment, they tend to strengthen system over time because it builds trust, it builds coordination and a shared sense of purpose. Some governments, some of our partner governments also use this type of mechanisms to identify what are the implementing partners they would like to continue working in the future. So definitely coordination and alignment is at the core for this type of model to work and to be successful.
Very interesting, especially for me, actually, Adriana, because I'm director of partnerships as well, and I know only too well how challenging it is to make these work. And it seems to me that everything you say suggests that actually the power of financing as a mechanism in itself is something that allows these things to move forward, which is very, very interesting. Okay, Chloe, did you want to react to anything that Adriana has just said, or
Yeah, I think one thing that comes to mind is also I think when you start focusing on outcomes, you can reduce the more siloed nature of traditional funding, and I think it opens up lots of possibilities to actually pool lots of different types of funding under in the form of an outcomes fund, of which Education Outcomes Fund is an excellent example of. And also, we're seeing emerging examples of how you can use outcomes-based financing to also incentivize cross-sector collaboration. We've recently helped design an impact bond in Cambodia that creates a shared set of outcomes for both demining and organic agriculture. And I think by creating a shared definition of success of what are traditionally two very distinct programs, you can incentivize that kind of very rich cross-sector collaboration, which is often what's needed for these more kind of challenging social issues.
Absolutely. Yeah, not thought of that at all. Fantastic. Shall we move to the next question, Chloe? I was wondering, after all of this this positive discussion on outcomes-based financing, are there any disadvantages that you actually can identify in a purely outcomes-based approach, and how can we minimize them?
Yes, absolutely. It's not all roses, and I think it's super important to talk about these limitations as well as the strengths. I really believe that outcomes-based approaches can be very powerful, but if they're applied in the wrong context or used too rigidly, they're at risk of being quite counterproductive. I think one way that we think about, at social finance, that we try and mitigate that is we often use three kind of deal breaker questions when we're looking at whether or not an outcomes based approach is right for this specific circumstance. And I think that helps us assess, whether or not there will be genuine value add as opposed to complexity. And I think it's worth just pausing on that point of complexity. This is still a relatively new, increasingly established mechanism. And I think we've come a long way in terms of streamlining design and the upfront costs that are associated with that. But they still are, more complex than traditional grants. And I think the proof is in the pudding. I think it's often worth that additional effort, but I think it's important to check that that is indeed the case. So in terms of these kind of questions that we ask at a very high level, I think the first is there a really clear definition of success? And I think, might sound obvious, but because funding is tied to outcomes, there needs to be absolute clarity on what these outcomes are. And that's easier in some sectors than in others. We've seen a lot of outcomes-based approaches in employment programs, and that's because success is quite well defined. Is somebody in a job? Are they sustaining that job? But in other areas, like, for example, in advocacy or female economic empowerment, it's much harder to measure and consistently define success. And that might be slightly trickier to think about outcomes-based financing in that space. Not to say that it can't be done, but I think understanding what success means upfront is super important. The second question is there a clear rationale? Is there a real reason for using an outcomes-based approach? I don't think outcomes-based financing should be used just because it's trendy and a bit of a buzzword at the moment. It really has to serve a purpose, and sometimes that can be about strengthening incentives, improving value for money, or to Adriana, the point we were talking about earlier, allowing flexibility in delivery. But I think if none of those rationales apply, then potentially other forms of funding might be more appropriate. And I think the last question is really about, is there enough uncertainty to make outcomes-based financing worthwhile? So if the intervention that you're looking at is very well understood, there's a proven link between inputs to outputs to outcomes, a straightforward grant might actually be a better tool. But which is often the case, you're trying something new, you're scaling up an intervention that's somewhat untested, or adapting a tried and tested model to a new population, or working in a quite complex and uncertain environment, then the flexibility that outcomes-based financing brings can be super valuable. So I think, in short, outcomes-based financing really isn't a silver bullet. It should be part of a broader funding toolkit used when the conditions are right, and when the answer to those three questions is a yes. And I think maybe just my last point here is really that outcomes-based financing outcomes-based approaches are a way of supporting an existing intervention, and they can only ever be as good as the intervention that they support.
Excellent. Thank you, Chloe. And finally, Adriana, just to kind of wrap up, because we've sort of touched upon this throughout the discussion, but how would you kind of conclude on the question of how can local partners really benefit from outcomes-based financing in a nutshell?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So based on our experience, we see that working with local partners is a truly win-win scenario, because the programs benefit greatly from these organizations, especially given their strong expertise and knowledge of the ground and the flexibility that the model allows. So for the results to be successful, this strong knowledge and the existing relationships are really a condition also for to drive good results. So local partnerships are very well placed to operate very well in this type of model. But in turn, I also see that they also benefit enormously from delivering this experience. And we've been observing this in our programs. There is a good mix of global organizations and smaller organizations. So we are seeing also this operating during implementation, how the partnerships with the impact investors and the way they've been operating in a very different way, benefiting from this greater flexibility, also tends to benefit them in the longer term. It definitely can strengthen their organizational capacity. So to deliver this type of mechanisms, they are often required to improve their internal capacity in monitoring and evaluation, data management, impact measurement, performance management. We see that impact investors, again, do play a role also in supporting, especially smaller local organizations, to gain that capacity, to set up the tools and processes and mechanisms, which ultimately are going to create a better capacity also to deliver future programs and bigger programs. Also, outcomes-based financing could help access to new markets and networks. We are also seeing that in practice, how some of these local partners sometimes have a very short experiences working with these big donors or even with the local government. So they gain exposure to international donors, these government bodies, who are ultimately more inclined to fund these organizations with a proven track record of achieving results in the longer term. They gain this legitimacy and this visibility also vis-a-vis these other players in the model. And finally, some organizations also use outcomes-based model to provide capacity building and technical assistance. We had a short experience doing that in our program in Tunisia, in which we partnered with the World Bank to support implementing partners during the procurement process, which sometimes is already the first filter that doesn't allow these organizations to have access to these large-scale initiatives. So I can definitely see a case that the programs benefit enormously from partnering with these local organizations, and they also in turn benefit from having this type of exposure and experience. It's still yet for us to continue like following up. I think towards the end of the program, would love also to understand what changes the exposure to this model also had in their internal processes, or even like future opportunities. But from what we can see, it's really like the type of partnership that is beneficial to all parties involved. And many donors also, as a matter of fact, they encourage openly local partners to be involved in this type of like implementation.
Increasingly so, yeah. Gosh, well, I think between the two of you, you've really convinced me that outcomes-based financing is a win-win, and I'm sure a lot of our audience will share that view. Just to mention, it's a good complement to watch this episode. Also looking at our episode on impact measurement. I think it's a natural kind of second stage to that discussion. That was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much to both of you. I think you've shed very, very clear light on what we need to be doing in the way that we finance our projects, and just we manage our partnerships as well. So next up on Afri-CAN, we will be discussing the role of innovation in democratizing healthcare in Africa. So please stay tuned. Thank you so much.